All of it seems like we're not getting a full picture of what exactly it was that happened in this case.
A 17-year-old Michigan girl vanishes after running away from home, only to reappear months later engaged to a 44-year-old stranger.
Because this guy would have to be one of the most sophisticated groomers and coercers that exist to get her. This is clearly not the first time this individual has targeted someone in a very vulnerable state, either emotionally or physically.
We're taking a closer look at the case, starting with what led up to the girl's disappearance.
We have to remember that she was 17 years old, so she's still developing the coping resources necessary to manage having conflicts like this.
Plus, a closer look at what happened during those 2 months when she willingly lived with the older man.
In order to keep her from leaving him, you would need to be able to convince her that he is the only person that loves her.
And perhaps the most important question of all, why didn't she leave?
It can be very confusing from the outsider to think, well, if she's able to leave, then why doesn't she just run and say that she was being abused and this guy was holding her captive? Because in her mind, she wasn't being held captive, that this guy wasn't abusing her.
To make sense of the case, I reached out to psychologist Dr. John Delatorre.
Someone who's already vulnerable in that position doesn't necessarily need a tremendous amount of grooming, but it would take someone who is sophisticated and confident enough in the grooming that they have done previously to get her in a vulnerable state to go with him.
The case begins on Friday, May 31st in Cedar Springs, Michigan, about 3 hours northwest of Detroit. At about 6 o'clock that evening, 17-year-old Penelope Wise, who goes by the nickname Penny, left her family's home after getting into a disagreement with her parents. We know that this is a 17-year-old girl, got in some sort of argument or disagreement with her parents, which, as a former 17-year-old girl, I know is somewhat normal. But she decides to run off. What goes into the process of this, somebody deciding to flee their house and actually leave for an extended period of time?
Well, you're right. We have to remember that she was 17 years old. So she's still developing the coping resources necessary to manage having conflicts like this. And obviously, conflicts for a 17-year-old, whether it's boy, girl, trans, whoever it is either going to be with the parents or it's going to be with someone at the school. So it's really kind of contained into what exactly it is that you're going to be able to do as the 17-year-old. And for her, it probably just felt like the only thing that she could do is just take off. She's clearly not thinking all that well, right? She's just in an argument. So she takes off. She maybe expects to cool down, whatever it is that she thinks that she's going to do. I don't know that she planned to end up where she ends up.
The last time Penny was seen was at about midnight on June 1st. Penny was caught on security camera video walking near a bar in Rockford, Michigan, about 12 miles south of her family home. Also of note, she was alone in the video. Almost right away, the search for Penny began. The Rockford Department of Public Safety said it conducted extensive searches with the help of rescue volunteers, U.S. Marshals, and even the FBI. I guess my first thought is, how did everybody miss her? I mean, we have the FBI on the case and they still didn't find her. Do you have any ideas behind that?
I mean, I don't exactly know how much resources these law enforcement. I mean, there's a lot that's going on in society right now. I don't know how much resources they're devoting to someone like this. I mean, we see later about the criminal charges issues. I think that they're in a position where, in this jurisdiction at least, someone who's 17 years old may have more authority and agency to do things just based on the laws on the books than someone who was 16 years or younger. So it might be something where they felt that their hands were tied already. So there was only so many things that they would have been able to do in order to look for her anyway.
Penny was missing for 50 days in all, and during that time, she was living with a 44-year-old man who she apparently met the very night she ran off. We're not listing the man's name publicly because he hasn't been charged with any crimes. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, she ends up meeting this stranger who she previously hadn't known. And to me, from the jump, that's kind of a red flag to meet this much older gentleman at 2 o'clock in the morning, but ends up going off with him. I mean, that to me kind of is curious because obviously she's at a different level mentally than him. He's an adult, she's still a child. What do you make of this initial encounter?
I think he specifically, I don't necessarily, I need to know why we think that he's a complete stranger. I don't like this because this guy would have to be one of the most sophisticated groomers and coercers that exist to get her. Again, now yes, she's probably in a highly emotional state, but still, the way that he's able to interact with her and then convince her to go with him suggests a level of familiarity with doing this. This is clearly not the first time this individual has targeted someone in a very vulnerable state, either emotionally or physically, probably through different chemicals like alcohol and drugs, something like that, or someone that is targeted just because they're significantly younger than him.
You mentioned grooming, and this is something that first jumped into my mind too, just specifically because of the instances that it was at 2 a.m., but then also because she's a vulnerable girl who is 17. Do you think that played a role, the grooming?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Grooming, we have to remember, is a breaking down of psychological barriers. Now, her barriers are already down because she's in an emotionally vulnerable state, having just had the argument with her parents. She just left home, so she's clearly angry, upset, right? She's feeling down about herself, but also she's 17 years old, so she doesn't really have the strength of boundaries that one would expect if they were an adult and had already lived a lot of years and experienced a lot of issues that life brings their way. So someone who's already vulnerable in that position doesn't necessarily need a tremendous amount of grooming, but it would take someone who is sophisticated and confident enough in the grooming that they have done previously to get her in a vulnerable state to go with him.
During her months away, Penny's family spoke to local news outlets, created flyers, and even the Facebook page Bring Penelope Home. Is it possible she knew that people were looking for her, her parents potentially, or even these news stories came up to her, and she just ignored it and decided to stay with this stranger?
Is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Is it probable? I don't think so. If this guy was totally and complete stranger, again, I'm not convinced of that just yet. But if he was a total and complete stranger and was able to get her at that moment, which I guess only took several minutes, then more than likely he would know to keep her isolated from everything. So no TVs, no radios, no internet, no nothing, no phones, nothing. So he most likely would have cut off her ability to communicate with a lot of people. Over time, some of that kind of goes away. You know, some of the restrictions can kind of go away that the individual can leave, but that's usually done after the individual has sort of fallen totally and complete victim to the abuses that person is inflicting upon them.
So, what do you think happened during those 2 months? I know that you mentioned potentially she was isolated in terms of TV or computers, internet, things like that. But what do you think was going on in their relationship?
It's hard to say. I mean, clearly it was abuse. That's number one. What kind of abuse and what forms that it would take? You know, it's hard because you would think that physical abuse and sexual abuse would be the most common things, but I think for sure emotional and psychological abuse, in order to keep her from leaving him, you would need to be able to convince her that he is the only person that loves her. You don't really do that physically. You have to kind of coerce the person, right? You have to make them think that they want that it's their idea to want to be there. And that really doesn't happen physically. It more happens psychologically. So I think there was a lot of sort of this pseudo love. A lot of people call it love bombing, right? These kinds of things where he's devoting a lot of attention to her to make her believe that she's the only one in his life.
According to reports, the man was a stranger to Penny, who just met her the night she left. But Dr. Delatorre says he isn't so sure. So, we've talked about this a lot that you're not thinking that he's a stranger just based on the instances, which I mean makes sense. This girl's 17 years old. She knows right from wrong. Why would she go with this person she doesn't even know? So, it's potential that they had some sort of familiarity, as you said. So, would you be surprised if we learned down the line that they actually had a prior relationship or at least knew each other?
Yes, but I think it's probably going to be a little bit more complicated than that. It's certainly possible that he was initiating sort of social media contacts and stuff like that. Her phone is going to be of the utmost importance when looking at why this ended up happening. But it's also possible that he created a different profile that wasn't him, right? That when he approached her, it was as if he was like some relation to this other person that she thought she was interacting with online. So I'm not sure that she knew it was him totally. I think he was manipulating her in some other way online and then was able to finally have this opportunity. Again, where was her phone? Was her phone on her this entire time that she's been gone? What exactly was it that um did she disconnect completely after this argument? What exactly it was that's happening? Because how would he know where she is if she didn't have contact with him? And if he is this kind of just, he's absolutely a stranger, someone that she didn't even know, then this guy has a long history of doing these kinds of things. Maybe he has a criminal record, maybe he doesn't, but there are a lot of other cases that would be similar to this that he's been involved in.
Penny was found on Sunday, July 21st, when someone recognized her and contacted authorities. Delatorre says her living circumstances may have changed a bit, but she probably wasn't trying to escape. And we talked about this too, that he likely kept her isolated, at least physically, for a while and then potentially gained trust in her. And that's what we saw end up happening, is that she eventually left this house or wherever she was staying and was on a bike. Someone spotted her from these previous news reports and called it in. So do you think that that's what's happened? He gained enough trust that kind of loosened the leash a bit and allowed her to leave the home?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be very confusing from the outsider to think, well, if she's able to leave, then why doesn't she just run and say that she was being abused and this guy was holding her captive? Because in her mind, she wasn't being held captive, that this guy wasn't abusing her. And that's the sophistication that I'm talking about when it comes to what this guy is able to do against her, right? The way he's able to violate her mind in such a way to make her believe that this is her idea, that she wants to be there with him. Again, that's a really hard thing to do for a stranger. If he is a stranger, again, I'm harping back on this, where this isn't the only time that he's done this thing to someone like this.
But when authorities finally caught up with Penny, she delivered some shocking news. Another curious aspect of this case is that when eventually she is found, news breaks that they're apparently engaged, this 17-year-old girl and this 44-year-old man, which is really what's making headlines because you don't often hear about that. She's a high school age student missing for 2 months and comes back found and is engaged. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, it's all part of the ruse that he's using to convince her that what he's doing is okay, right? He's convincing her of his love for her, and she's believing it. And here's an example of, right, the ring on her finger is the example of his undevoted love, of his undying love for her, and her not being sophisticated in manipulation techniques and tactics used by men. Uh, she fell victim to those things, and he purposefully chose her in a vulnerable state and convinced her of all these things because that's just kind of maybe what she had expected for her life. Maybe that's what she was being taught, and so she fell victim to those traps.
Officials with the Kent County Sheriff's Office said Penny wasn't reunited with her parents immediately after she was found. On Monday, they told local news outlets, quote, "We can't really get into what she's in custody for because she is a juvenile still in the eyes of the law, but she hasn't been reunited back with the family. We're just trying to connect her with services before she makes it back home." but it's still unclear what's ahead for her now fiance. I don't know what the contact situation is going to be with this guy, but what do you expect for the future of their so-called relationship? Is it going to take a while for her to kind of undo this potential grooming?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's going to be whether or not she even sees it as grooming. I mean, there's nothing to suggest that she is okay with being back with her parents. I mean, it's certainly possible that this guy was still trying to convince her that the arguments that she's had with her parents previously are examples of them not taking her seriously, of them not believing that she's a grown woman, right? Or whatever it is that he was using, whatever it was that he was using against her with her parents. So it's really going to be up to her to decide to see what actually happened. And a lot of people don't end up seeing what happened. So they fall victim again and again. And some people do, and they really struggle. Right? Therapy is going to be helpful. Family therapy is definitely going to be necessary. It really is up to the individual as to what exactly it is that she's going to have for the rest of her life. This is now the time that she gets to actually have her own agency, where she gets to choose what she wants to do moving forward. And hopefully her parents are in a position to embrace her, understand that people make mistakes, that this isn't defining of her as an individual, and hopefully they can move past whatever the argument was that led her to leaving from before, and get her in a position to feel safe, secure, and back in love with her family.
But they are engaged right now, apparently. Do you think it's possible that they actually do get married?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I don't know what the laws are for this jurisdiction, whether or not the parents have to agree to something like this. With him not having any criminal charges, it's certainly possible that the parents don't have to agree. That she's 17 years old and she gets to make the decision. I mean, it's going to be real hard to keep the two apart in this jurisdiction if there are no criminal charges levied against the guy.
According to the Kent County Sheriff's Office, charges have not been filed against the 44-year-old man, and as of now, they likely won't be. So we've talked about that, the no criminal charges, which is shocking to me. Why were charges not filed? What do you think?
It sounds like she's falling in this gray area of sort of adulthood, where in a lot of jurisdictions, 16 and younger tend to be a juvenile, and then anything over that, right? Anything over an age of 18 is clearly the age of majority. So the 17 kind of falls into this gray area where you could have already graduated from high school. So it's certainly possible that you are capable of making adult decisions, and that this isn't a crime, like she hasn't committed a crime. So I think that there's this, it's those few times where there's gaps in the law that really prevent these kinds of abuse victims from actually getting the justice that they need and getting the services that they require for being abused.
Delatorre says it's a bizarre story, but prompts a larger conversation.
It really is this curious thing of her falling through the cracks. We really have to look at um, how we view age and how we view development and how we view the laws that are supposed to be in place to protect our children. And children remain children, right? As a parent, children remain children even when they're 35, 45 years old. So we really have to start thinking about what exactly is it that we want for our society to protect our kids, and at what age are we willing to say that someone is willing to make and capable of making adult decisions. And it's really up to a society to decide how that's going to go, because in certain cases things like this that clearly demand justice probably isn't going to happen.
Penny's disappearance is still under investigation by the Kent County Sheriff's Office. Once that's complete, prosecutors will review the case to determine whether charges should be filed. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.